Trump administration will establish a clear principle that will govern all decisions pertaining to immigration. And we will be tough, and we will be even extreme. We should only admit into this country those who share our values and respect our people. In the Cold War, we had an ideological screening test. The time is overdue to develop a new screening test for the threats we face today. I call it extreme vetting. I call it extreme vetting. Our country has enough problems. We don't need more, and these are problems like we've never had before. One of my first acts as president will be to establish a commission on radical Islam, which will include reformist voices in the Muslim community who will hopefully work with us. We want to build bridges and erase divisions. The goal of the commission will be to identify and explain to the American public the core convictions and beliefs of radical Islam, to identify the warning signs of radicalization, and to expose the networks in our society that support radicalization. We will also keep open Guantanamo Bay and place a renewed emphasis on human intelligence. Drone strikes will remain part of our strategy, but we will also seek to capture high-value targets to gain needed information to dismantle their organizations. We will defeat radical Islamic terrorism, just as we have defeated every threat we've faced at every age and before. But we will not, remember this, defeat it with closed eyes or silenced voices. We have a president that doesn't want to say the words. Anyone who cannot name our enemy is not fit to lead our country.
Former Florida Congressman Lieutenant Colonel Alan West goes on the record. Good evening, sir.
Good evening, Greta. How are you?
Very well. So this was billed in part as a speech that would lay out Donald Trump's plan to destroy ISIS. Are you satisfied with the speech? Did you get that information?
Well, I think that one of the most important things you have to do is not have such a narrow focus. I think you have to look at this globally. What I would have recommended to Mr. Trump is that you sit down and look at what we call the geographic areas of responsibility. European Command, Pacific Command, Central Command, Africa Command, Southern Command, and then here in the continental United States of America. And what you want to do is apply what we call the 4 elements of national power, which is called the DIME theory: diplomatic, informational, military, and economic, to define the enemy in those respective geographical regions and talk about your strategy to defeat the enemies in those regions. I think that when we try to narrow this focus down to just ISIS, we miss out on the greater global Islamic jihad issue that we have. And I think that that's where Donald Trump could have done a little bit better. I think that this whole thing about a commission on Islam, you have a National Security Council. That's the job of the President, the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, and the National Security Advisor. So we don't really need to have another commission.
All right, so you don't like the commission. You wanted more details on his speech. So are you telling me that you were not satisfied with it, or did you get some information? As you listened to it today, do you have a greater sense of what he's going to do about ISIS if he's elected president?
Well, I think you have to be very fair and understand you're talking to someone that spent 22 years active duty military service, and even after that 2.5 years in Afghanistan training their forces, and I also spent a couple of years on the House Armed Services Committee. So I'm kind of privy to a little bit more of a strategic military decision-making process. And what I would recommend for Mr. Trump is to sit down with Major General Bob Scales, who used to be the Commandant of the National War College, and really understand strategic level decision-making, especially when, as I said, you relate that DIME theory, those elements of national power.
Well, I assume that he's got some military advisor. I think General Flynn is advising him. So, I mean, I assume that he has some military people advising him. Would you have wanted them to supply him with more details to lay out how he's going to destroy ISIS?
Well, I think that if you sit down with someone like a General Scales who has been part of the academic environment that can talk about strategic imperatives, you know, for instance, I would say there are 4 critical strategic imperatives to defeat the global Islamic jihad. It has to be denying them sanctuary. You have to cut off their flow of men, material, and resource support. You have to also win that information operations war and delegitimizing their ideology, and you have to cordon them off and not allow them to metastasize and spread across, you know, many different nations. He did talk about the 18 nations where ISIS has a presence, but you have to talk about this greater movement. Now, General Flynn is without a doubt one of the foremost military experts in intelligence gathering and processes and procedures, and I think he is a very helpful asset to have. But I think that General Scales could really help him in fine-tuning his strategic vision when it comes to national security.
And I didn't mean by suggesting General Flynn to take anything from General Scales. In fact, I'll tell you, I'll give you a little tip. He has a new book coming out next month. I just saw an advanced copy. Anyway, that's my tip. Anyway, Colonel West, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Greta.
In today's speech, Donald Trump talked ISIS.
Overseas, ISIS has carried out an absolute atrocity, and one after another. Children slaughtered, girls sold into slavery, men and women burned alive, crucifixions, beheadings, and drownings, ethnic minorities targeted for mass execution, holy sites desecrated, Christians driven from their homes and hunted for extermination. ISIS rounding up what it calls Nation of the Cross, in a campaign of absolute and total genocide. We cannot let this evil continue. The rise of ISIS is the direct result of policy decisions made by President Obama and Secretary of State Clinton.
Former Navy SEAL Leif Babin goes on the record. Good evening, sir.
Good evening, Greta. Good to be with you.
Nice to have you. So, listening to Donald Trump's speech today about ISIS foreign policy, were you satisfied with that he laid out information that tells you what he would do if he's president?
What I liked about his speech today was that he acknowledged the threat. And we talk about this with leadership all the time. Successful leadership requires a brutally honest assessment of yourself, of your team, and certainly of your adversary. And in this case, there's no way under the Obama administration, and certainly Hillary Clinton would continue that, if you deny who your enemies are, that they're even a threat, and try to gloss them over with talking points or spin them to your political advantage, we're never going to actually solve that. So it was very refreshing to see him acknowledge the nature and seriousness of the threat.
You know, there weren't many details, but you know, I'm not sure I was looking for details from either one of them, because I don't know if you can lay out details about your military action. At least I don't know if you can lead it, you know, in great detail. I think you have to give your ideology, your theory, give you some of your general positions. But some people may be dissatisfied that he didn't say, you know, more details. But I don't expect that from either one of them. Do you?
I certainly didn't hear any details today, but I think you're right. I mean, I think we've put out way too much detail over the last 8 years or so of the Obama administration, and that's unnecessary. I think we can talk in general talking points. And the reality is, this is not that hard of an enemy to defeat. It requires some U.S. troops involved, but we have got some outstanding military leadership on the ground in Iraq and Syria today that can make this happen. All we have to do is tell them, we need you to win. You tell me what you need to win. Give them what they need, and they'll get it done.
Well, is it not more complicated? Because at first, when it was just in Syria, it was a different target. As it sort of metastasized around the world into all these sort of cells, hasn't it become a little different enemy or a different strategy to try to kill them? Because it has metastasized.
It certainly has metastasized, Greta, but that's only because we've allowed it to do so. And had we taken the necessary steps to destroy ISIS 2 years ago, we could have absolutely done that. I mean, when they called themselves al-Qaeda in Iraq, just as Trump said today, they were on the verge of defeat. And we can very easily do that. We just have to give our military folks the power to do so.
Leif, thank you.